biggest questions we have in modern politics.
Yeah.
How do seemingly strong democracies crumble?
Hmm.
It's not always like some dramatic coup, right?
Right.
Sometimes it's this slow, kind of almost invisible erosion.
Yeah, you're thinking of How Democracies Die, right?
Yeah.
It's chilling
It is.
how they argue that most democracies are more likely to erode from within
Right.
subtly than be overthrown in some big dramatic event.
Exactly. And today we're taking a deep dive into that process, how
Yeah.
this erosion happens,
Mhm.
how it connects to populism, and what we can learn from examples around the world,
Yeah.
both past and present. But before we get into all that,
Yeah.
can you give us kind of a clear definition of populism?
Uh-huh.
It's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot,
Right.
but I'm not sure everyone really understands what it means.
Yeah, it's definitely a tricky one.
Yeah.
But at its core, populism is a political approach that claims to represent the true will of the people.
Okay.
Usually portrayed as like a pure, unified group against a corrupt or out-of-touch elite.
So it's all about tapping into that feeling of like us versus them.
Exactly, and that message can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
Especially when people are feeling disillusioned or unheard.
Right.
Think about times of economic hardship, or when trust in institutions is low.
Mm-hmm.
Populism offers simple solutions.
Right.
A clear enemy to blame, and a charismatic leader who promises to fight for the ordinary person.
Okay. I can see how that would be appealing, especially in those kinds of circumstances.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there's dark side to this too, right?
Absolutely. While populism can be a force for positive change,
Right.
it's also incredibly vulnerable to being exploited.
Okay.
The same dynamics that make it appealing can be used to undermine democracy itself.
So how does that happen?
Hmm.
How does this seemingly positive energy turn into something dangerous?
Well, imagine a charismatic leader who rides a wave of populist support into office.
Okay.
They've made big promises about shaking things up, draining the swamp, fighting for the forgotten man.
Yeah.
People are excited. They're hopeful.
Uh-huh.
But that excitement can make them less critical,
Yeah.
less attentive to the leader's actions.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this plays out. So
Yeah.
what happens next?
This is where the concept of democratic backsliding comes in.
Okay.
Instead of a dramatic coup, there's a gradual erosion of norms and institutions.
Right.
Think of it like termites eating away at the foundation of a house.
Mm-hmm.
Each individual action might seem small,
Mhm.
but over time, the damage becomes significant.
That's a pretty unsettling image.
Yeah,
Can you give us some specific examples of what this democratic backsliding might look like in practice?
absolutely. Packing courts with loyalists is a classic tactic.
Okay.
You also see leaders trying to control the media narrative,
Right.
either by silencing critical voices or by creating their own propaganda outlets.
Hmm.
And of course, there's always the temptation to change electoral laws to benefit their party or make it harder for opponents to win.
So it's about using the system itself to dismantle it from within.
Exactly.
And the scariest part is each of these actions might seem justifiable on its own,
Right.
especially if you're convinced that you're on the side of the true people.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
That's what makes this process so insidious. It's rarely a sudden power grab.
Mm.
It's a slow burn, a series of seemingly small steps
Right.
that over time add up to a fundamental shift in the balance of power.
That brings to mind that chilling line from How Democracies Die. Democracy's assassins use the very institutions of democracy,
Yeah.
gradually, subtly, and even legally, to kill it.
It's a chilling thought.
It is.
And unfortunately, history is full of examples of this exact pattern playing out.
All right, well, let's get into some of those examples.
Okay.
I know we've got quite a world tour planned today, both geographically and historically. Where should we start?
Let's begin with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela.
Okay.
He initially came to power democratically,
Right.
promising positive change for the people,
Uh-huh.
but his rule gradually took a darker turn.
Okay.
What's fascinating here is that many of his early moves were welcomed, especially by the poor and marginalized who felt ignored by the existing system.
Right.
He implemented social programs, nationalized industries,
Mm-hmm.
actions that solidified his image as a champion of the people.
It's interesting because it highlights how this process can be so deceptive.
Yeah,
On the surface, it might even look like democracy is flourishing,
right.
but what's happening beneath the surface?
That's the key. While Chavez was building his public image,
Okay.
He was simultaneously laying the groundwork for authoritarian rule.
Right.
He began blacklisting political opponents, essentially silencing any voices that challenged his authority.
Right.
Then he moved on to packing the Supreme Court with loyalists,
Oh.
ensuring that any legal challenges to his power would be met with favorable rulings.
So you're stacking the deck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And eventually he even removed presidential term limits,
Wow.
allowing him to stay in power indefinitely.
So it's a gradual process, but ultimately
Right.
it leads to the same outcome, the concentration of power in the hands of one person,
Right.
and the dismantling of any checks on that power.
Exactly. And it's a stark reminder that even democratically elected leaders can,
Yeah.
and sometimes do, erode democratic norms if they're not held in check.
Okay, so Venezuela under Chavez is one example of this pattern playing out.
Right.
Where should we go next on our world tour?
Let's jump back in time to Benito Mussolini's Italy.
Okay.
This is a particularly fascinating case because it highlights the danger
Yeah.
of mainstream elites forming alliances with populist leaders,
Okay.
thinking they can control them for their own purposes.
Ah, yes, the classic riding the tiger scenario.
Exactly.
And I'm guessing it didn't end well.
Not at all. Mussolini rose to prominence after World War I, a time of immense social and economic turmoil in Italy.
Right.
He positioned himself as a strong leader who could restore order and national pride. Many elites, fearing the rise of socialism and labor movements,
Right.
saw Mussolini as a bulwark against the left.
Okay.
They thought they could use his popularity to advance their own interests
Yeah.
and maintain their grip on power.
But that backfired spectacularly, didn't it?
It did. Mussolini's fascist party gained popularity.
Right.
And once in power, he moved quickly to consolidate his control. He suppressed opposition parties, dismantled democratic institutions,
Yeah.
and established a dictatorship that lasted for over 2 decades.
It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating populist leaders and the folly of thinking you can manipulate them for your own ends.
Yeah,
Once they have a taste of power, it's very difficult to control them.
precisely. And it's a pattern that we've seen repeated throughout history,
Yeah.
even in countries with long-standing democratic traditions.
Yeah. That brings us to a rather uncomfortable example.
Oh,
Donald Trump's presidency in the United States.
right.
He was democratically elected, but many would argue his time in office was marked by a significant breakdown of democratic norms.
That's a fair assessment. Trump's presidency was characterized by a number of concerning trends.
Okay.
He repeatedly questioned the legitimacy of elections, especially when he lost.
Right.
He consistently attacked the free press, labeling any reporting he didn't like as fake news.
Right.
And perhaps most damagingly, he constantly demonized his political opponents.
Yeah.
Creating a deeply polarized and hostile political climate.
It's definitely an example of how even a well-established democracy like the United States is not immune to the dangers of populism and democratic erosion.
Exactly. And it highlights how crucial it is
Right.
to be vigilant about protecting democratic norms,
Yeah.
even in systems that seems stable and resilient.
Okay. So we've covered Venezuela, Italy, and the United States.
Okay.
Where to next on our democratic backsliding world tour?
Let's shift our focus to Viktor Orban's Hungary.
Okay.
His story is particularly interesting because he actually started his political career as a liberal Democrat.
That is interesting. What caused him to shift so dramatically towards a more authoritarian approach?
Well, over time, Orban gradually embraced a more nationalist and populist platform.
Okay.
He's been in power for over a decade now. And during that time, he systematically eroded democratic checks and balances in Hungary.
Can you give us some specific examples of how he's done that?
One of his key strategies has been gaining control over the media.
Okay.
He's used a combination of political pressure and financial incentives to silence critical voices
Right.
and create a media landscape that largely supports his agenda. He's also packed the judiciary with loyalists, undermining the independence of the courts.
Okay.
And of course, he's changed electoral laws to benefit his party Fidesz,
Right.
making it more difficult for opposition parties to gain power.
So it's a similar playbook to what we've seen in other cases.
Yeah.
Control the information, control the courts, control the elections.
Exactly.
It's a recipe for dismantling democracy from within.
Unfortunately, it is. And Orban's Hungary is a stark reminder that Democratic backsliding can happen anywhere,
Yeah.
even in countries that were once considered models of democratic progress.
So what's the common thread running through all these examples?
Hmm.
What makes populism so appealing to voters,
Yeah,
even when it can ultimately lead to the erosion of their own freedoms?
that's the key question, isn't it?
It is.
And it's a complex one with no easy answers.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating question.
It is.
I mean, if populism can be so dangerous to democracy, why does it resonate so strongly with voters? What are the underlying conditions that allow it to take root and flourish?
There are a few key factors, and they often work together to create an environment ripe for populist movements.
Okay, let's unpack those. What's the first one?
One major driver is economic inequality. When there's a large gap between the rich and the poor, and when people feel like the system is rigged against them,
Right.
they're more likely to be drawn to populist messages that often promise to shake things up, redistribute wealth, and punish the elites, who are perceived to be benefiting from the status quo.
So in a sense, populism thrives on a sense of economic injustice, real or perceived.
Exactly.
Is that what we saw in Venezuela under Chavez?
Absolutely. Chavez tapped into deep-seated resentment among the poor and working class,
Right.
who felt excluded from Venezuela's oil wealth.
Okay.
His promises to nationalize industries and redistribute resources resonated with those who felt left behind by the traditional economic system. And while some of his early policies did provide some relief, the long-term consequences were disastrous.
Right.
The economy ultimately collapsed, and those who had initially supported him ended up suffering the most.
So it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of simplistic solutions to complex problems. And it also highlights how populists are often very adept at exploiting people's genuine grievances for their own gain.
That's a crucial point. They offer easy answers, a clear enemy to blame,
Right?
and a charismatic leader who promises to fight for the little guy.
Yeah.
It's a powerful narrative, especially when people are struggling and looking for someone to champion their cause.
All right, so economic inequality is one major driver of populism. What else is at play here?
Another key factor is cultural polarization.
Okay.
We live in an increasingly interconnected world,
Right.
and that interconnectedness can lead to anxiety and insecurity. People worry about losing their jobs to globalization, their culture to immigration,
Right.
their national identity to a perceived globalist elite.
It sounds like a recipe for fear and resentment.
Yeah.
And those emotions are fertile ground for populist rhetoric.
Exactly. Populists are masters at exploiting these anxieties and turning them into political capital.
Right.
They create a narrative of us versus them, pitting the real people against some sinister other
Right.
who is supposedly threatening their way of life.
And again, that goes back to that core populist idea of a pure and unified people being exploited by a corrupt elite.
Exactly.
But in this case, the elite isn't just economic, it's also cultural or even racial.
You're right. Think about the rise of far-right parties in Europe.
Okay.
They often scapegoat immigrants and minorities, blaming them for economic woes, crime,
Right.
and a perceived decline in traditional values.
Yeah.
This tactic can be incredibly effective in mobilizing support, even if it leads to dangerous levels of intolerance and division.
It's really disheartening to see how these tactics can be used to manipulate people and erode social cohesion.
Yeah.
But you mentioned a third factor that contributes to populism's rise. What is that?
That third factor is distrust in institutions.
Okay.
When people lose faith in government political parties, the media, and other traditional sources of authority, they become more susceptible to populist appeals.
And I can see how that distrust can create a vicious cycle. I mean, if you already believe that the system is rigged against you, then a populist leader who rails against the establishment is going to seem like a breath of fresh air.
That's exactly right.
Right.
Populists thrive in environments where there's a widespread sense that the traditional institutions are failing to address people's concerns.
Right.
They position themselves as outsiders, as the only ones who can truly represent the will of the people and shake up a broken system.
But haven't we seen that this distrust can actually be exacerbated by populist leaders themselves?
Absolutely. One of the most insidious tactics of populist leaders is to actively undermine trust in institutions.
Okay.
They attack the media as fake news.
Right.
They accuse the courts of being biased. They claim that elections are rigged, all in an effort to sow doubt
Right.
and delegitimize any source of authority that might challenge their power.
So it's a self-reinforcing cycle. The more distrust there is, the more appealing populism becomes.
Yeah.
And then populist leaders further erode that trust. Once they're in power, it's a dangerous game.
It is, and that's why it's so important to recognize the warning signs of democratic backsliding
Yeah.
and to be actively engaged in protecting our institutions and holding our leaders accountable.
But before we get into solutions, I think it's worth digging a bit deeper into the psychology of populism.
Okay.
Why are some people more drawn to it than others? Is there something about the populist message
Right.
that taps into deeper psychological needs or vulnerabilities?
That's a fascinating question, and there's a growing body of research that explores the psychological underpinnings of populism.
Okay.
One theory suggests that people who are drawn to populist messages tend to have a stronger need for certainty and order.
That makes sense. The world is a complex and often chaotic place.
Right.
It's natural to crave simple explanations and clear solutions,
Yeah.
even if those explanations and solutions are oversimplified or unrealistic.
Exactly. And populist leaders excel at providing that sense of
There you go.
certainty. They offer a black and white view of the world,
Right.
where the good guys are clearly defined. The enemy is easily identifiable,
Uh-huh.
and the solutions are straightforward.
Yeah.
It's a very appealing narrative,
Yeah.
especially in times of uncertainty and anxiety.
And I imagine that social media and the internet, with their echo chambers and filter bubbles, have only amplified this tendency. It's easier than ever to surround yourself with information that
Bizarre.
confirms your existing worldview
Right.
and to demonize those who hold different views.
You're absolutely right. The rise of social media has created new opportunities
Uh-huh.
for populist leaders to spread their message,
Right.
connect with supporters, and bypass traditional media gatekeepers.
Okay.
It's also made it easier for people to self-segregate into online communities,
Yeah.
where they are only exposed to information that reinforces their existing beliefs.
So we've got a perfect storm brewing: economic inequality, cultural polarization,
Right.
institutional distrust, and a media landscape that amplifies those divisions and anxieties. Yeah.
It's no wonder that populism is on the rise in so many parts of the world.
It's a worrying trend, to be sure.
Yeah.
But the good news is that we're not powerless in the face of these challenges.
Okay.
There are strategies we can employ to resist populist threats and safeguard our democracies.
All right. That's what I want to hear. Let's shift gears and talk about solutions.
Okay.
What can we do to push back against this tide of populism and protect our democratic values? Well, first and foremost, we need strong and responsible political parties.
Okay.
They play a crucial role in vetting candidates, setting agendas,
Right.
and upholding democratic norms.
Mm.
When parties become weak or fragmented, or when they abandon their commitment to democratic principles,
Right.
it creates an opening for populist outsiders to exploit.
That makes sense. Parties act as gatekeepers,
Yeah.
ensuring that those who seek power are committed to the rules of the game.
Right.
But we've seen how parties can fail in this role, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the rise of Donald Trump within the Republican Party is a prime example of how a party structure can be hijacked by a populist outsider.
It's a cautionary tale, and it highlights the need for party reform.
Okay.
One idea is to reform primary systems to make them more inclusive
Uh-huh.
and less susceptible to manipulation by extreme factions.
Okay.
Another important step is to encourage greater civic engagement within parties,
Right.
empowering rank-and-file members to hold their leaders accountable,
Okay.
and ensuring that the party's platform reflects the values of its broader base.
So strengthening political parties is one key strategy. But what about looking to history for inspiration?
Yeah.
Are there examples of democracies that have successfully resisted populist threats?
There are some inspiring examples. Finland's rejection of the far-right Lapua movement in the 1930s
Okay.
is a fascinating case study.
Hmm.
The Lapua movement gained popularity during the Great Depression,
Right.
exploiting economic anxieties and promoting an ultranationalist agenda.
Okay.
They even attempted a coup d'etat in 1932.
Sounds eerily familiar, right?
It does. But Finland's mainstream political parties, both left and right,
Uh-huh.
recognized the danger posed by the Lapua movement and formed a united front to oppose them. They condemned their extremist rhetoric, defended democratic institutions,
Whoa.
and eventually succeeded in marginalizing them politically.
Wow, that's an impressive show of unity and commitment to democratic values.
It is.
Are there any other historical examples that offer hope?
Austria's experience in 2016 is another encouraging case.
Okay.
The far-right Freedom Party, capitalizing on anti-immigrant sentiment and economic anxieties,
Right.
came very close to winning the presidency.
Wow.
But after the initial election resulted in a narrow victory for the Freedom Party candidate,
Uh-huh.
Austria's mainstream parties formed a coalition to prevent them from gaining power in the subsequent runoff.
So these examples show that it is possible to fight back against populism and protect democracy, even when it seems like the tide is turning against you.
Absolutely.
But it requires vigilance, courage, and a willingness to put aside partisan differences in defense of shared values.
Exactly. We can't be complacent.
Right.
We need to actively defend democratic norms and institutions.
Yeah.
And we need to hold our leaders accountable when they undermine those norms. And we need to do it together across partisan lines.
It sounds like we need to rediscover the art of civil discourse.
We do.
We need to be able to disagree without demonizing each other,
Yeah.
to have difficult conversations without resorting to name-calling and personal attacks. Is that even possible?
It's a challenge, but it's essential.
Yeah.
We need to find ways to rebuild trust, to bridge divides, and to foster a sense of shared purpose. And that starts with recognizing that we have more in common than what divides us.
Right.
We all want a society that is fair, just, and prosperous.
Yeah.
We all want a future where our children and grandchildren can thrive.
That's a powerful reminder. We can't lose sight of our common humanity,
Right.
even when we disagree on the best path forward. So rebuilding trust is crucial. But what about those root causes of populism we talked about earlier? Economic inequality, cultural polarization,
Right.
institutional distrust. How do we address those systemic issues?
That's where it gets even more challenging. But it's also where the real work lies. We need to find ways to create a more just and equitable society where everyone has the opportunity to succeed.
Right.
We need to address the anxieties and insecurities that fuel cultural polarization and find ways to promote greater social cohesion. And we need to rebuild trust in our institutions,
Right.
demonstrating that they can be responsive to the needs of the people they serve.
It's a tall order, but it's clear that we can't just focus on symptoms.
Right.
We need to address the underlying conditions that make societies vulnerable to populism in the first place.
Exactly. It's a multifaceted challenge that requires a comprehensive approach.
Okay, so we've talked about strengthening institutions, rebuilding trust,
Yeah.
and addressing the root causes of populism. But ultimately, it all comes down to the actions of individual citizens, right?
You're absolutely right.
What can ordinary people do to protect democracy and push back against the forces of populism?
We can't rely on institutions or political parties alone to safeguard democracy.
Right.
It's up to each and every one of us to be active and engaged citizens.
So it's not enough to just vote every few years, right?
Right.
What are some concrete ways we can be more active citizens, in our day-to-day lives?
It starts with being informed.
Okay.
That means seeking out reliable sources of information, being critical of what you read and hear,
Right.
and being willing to engage with diverse perspectives.
Okay.
It also means holding our leaders accountable,
Yeah.
whether that's through contacting our representatives, participating in protests,
Right.
or supporting organizations that are working to protect democratic values.
And I think it's important to emphasize, the importance of constructive dialogue.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in the outrage of the moment to demonize those who disagree with us.
Right.
But that kind of polarization only makes things worse.
It does.
We need to find ways to have respectful conversations.
Right.
Even with those we disagree with.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Democracy thrives on debate and disagreement,
Yeah.
but those disagreements need to be grounded in facts and evidence.
Right.
And they need to be conducted with civility and respect. When we lose the ability to talk to each other constructively, we create a breeding ground for extremism and division.
All right, so we've talked about individual actions,
Yeah.
but are there larger systemic changes that could help protect democracies from backsliding? Are there specific policies or reforms that have been proven effective?
There are a number of promising ideas out there.
Okay.
Electoral reforms can play a big role.
Okay.
For example, ranked choice voting system
Right.
can help reduce polarization by encouraging candidates to appeal to a broader range of voters.
Interesting.
Campaign finance reform can also help level the playing field
Right.
and reduce the influence of special interests, and strengthening civic education programs can help equip citizens with the knowledge and skills they need
Right.
to be informed and engaged participants in democracy.
So there are tools available to us both at the individual and systemic level.
There are.
It's not a hopeless situation.
Not at all. Democracies are resilient.
Right.
They've faced challenges throughout history and emerged stronger.
Yeah.
But that resilience depends on the active participation of citizens who are informed, engaged, and committed to defending their freedoms.
Before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more thing.
Okay.
It's something you mentioned earlier. The idea that democratic backsliding often happens gradually,
Right.
almost imperceptibly. How can we be more attuned to those subtle signs of erosion
Right.
so we don't wake up one day and realize that our democracy has been hollowed out from within?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
It requires a certain level of vigilance, a willingness to pay attention to those seemingly small changes that can have big consequences over time. Are courts being packed with partisan loyalists? Are independent media outlets being silenced or undermined? Are electoral laws being changed to benefit one party over another?
Right.
Are political opponents being demonized or dehumanized? These are all warning signs that we need to take seriously.
It's almost like we need to develop a kind of democratic early warning system.
I like that.
A way to track these trends and sound the alarm before it's too late.
We need to be proactive, not reactive.
Right.
We need to identify those pressure points in the system and be prepared to defend them.
Right.
And that means being willing to speak out, to organize, to hold our leaders accountable.
So it's not just about being aware of the problem.
No.
It's about being willing to do something about it.
Yes.
To stand up for what we believe in, even when it's difficult.
Right.
Even when it feels like the odds are stacked against us.
Exactly. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation from all of us.
Yeah.
And the stakes have never been higher.
Well, this has been a sobering but ultimately empowering conversation.
It has.
We've explored the dangers of populism, the subtle ways that democracies can erode, and the factors that make societies vulnerable to these threats.
Yeah.
But we've also highlighted the resilience of democracies, the inspiring examples of those who have fought back against authoritarianism.
It's possible.
And the concrete actions that we can all take to protect our freedoms.
Absolutely.
It's been a pleasure diving deep into this topic with you. I hope our listeners will come away from this conversation feeling informed, engaged, and empowered to play an active role in shaping the future of democracy.
I couldn't agree more.
So remember, the future of democracy is not something that happens to us. It's something we create together through our actions and our choices.
Right.
So let's choose wisely. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Thanks.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.